on that block right there with them dudes you looking at right there. It's my mama's house.
Before the world ever heard the voice of Steve Harvey, before the tailored suits, primetime game shows, and best-selling books, there was just a small boy in Welch, West Virginia, born into a reality that offered very little comfort. Steve Harvey came into the world on January 17, 1957, as Broderick Stephen Harvey, the youngest of 5 children in a modest working-class family. His father, Jesse Harvey, was a coal miner whose lungs bore the cost of every shift underground. His mother, Eloise Vera, was a dedicated teacher, constantly stretching what little money they had to keep the family afloat. There were no silver spoons or stage lights in Steve's childhood, only chalk dust on his mother's hands, coal dust on his father's boots, and a deep-rooted sense that life was a daily fight to survive. Growing up in poverty meant food was scarce, winters were brutal, and every piece of clothing was patched until it couldn't be mended anymore. And that wasn't the only hardship. Steve struggled with a stutter that made speaking in class a source of constant shame. Every attempt to read aloud or answer a question became a target for laughter. But here's where it starts to cut deeper. One day, in elementary school, his teacher asked the students to write about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Steve, with all the hope he could muster, wrote down, "I want to be on television." The class burst into laughter. His teacher didn't just laugh, she tore the paper in half and even called his parents, claiming he was being unrealistic and arrogant. That moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. He later said, "I still hear that paper tearing." It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was his dream. His mother stayed silent, but his father, despite all his struggles, looked his son in the eyes and said, "Write it down again. Put it on your wall. Read it every morning and every night." From that day forward, Steve Harvey did just that. He kept that dream alive, turning it into a mantra. Fast forward to the 1960s, and his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, settling on East 112th Street. The neighborhood was rough, and poverty followed them like a shadow. Steve often walked to school with holes in his shoes, trying not to let his classmates see how badly he was struggling. Racism wasn't some abstract concept, it was a daily reality. Being a black kid with a stutter in a poor neighborhood meant every single step towards success was twice as hard. And yet, he kept going. By the time he reached Glenville High School, Steve still had that dream burning inside him. Even though teachers didn't believe in him and kids mocked him, he held on to the words his father told him. That dream, that one sentence, became the foundation he would build his life on. Looking back, it's unbelievable how far that torn-up paper travelled. Years later, when he finally made it onto television, Steve Harvey would send his old teacher a new TV every Christmas, along with a note that read, "Here's the television you said I'd never be on." It wasn't about revenge, it was about proving that resilience beats ridicule. This was just the beginning. Before the sold-out arenas, before the stage lights and laughter, there was a kid who refused to give up on a dream, even when it was ripped to pieces. As the 1970s began, Steve Harvey had no blueprint for success, just that same handwritten dream and a growing list of odd jobs. After graduating high school in 1974, he tried college briefly at Kent State University, then moved to West Virginia University, but the academic path didn't stick. His ambition burned hot, but the path forward was jagged and uncertain. He bounced from job to job, mailman, carpet cleaner, auto mechanic, even boxer, all the while wondering how that childhood dream would ever come true. But life wasn't gentle. Steve wasn't making real money, and more importantly, none of it was feeding his soul. He was just surviving, barely. Then in 1985, something unexpected changed everything. A friend dared him to perform at a comedy club's open mic night. With nothing to lose, Steve walked on stage in front of a small, smoky crowd in Cleveland. His heart pounded, but he delivered his first joke, then another, and something clicked. Laughter filled the room. Not mockery, but real laughter. That night, he earned $50. It wasn't much, but to Steve, it was everything. As he walked home, he cried, not out of sadness, but relief. "I was born tonight," he whispered. That same week, he quit his job. He wasn't just chasing a paycheck anymore, he was chasing a purpose. But here's the reality most people don't see. The next 3 years were brutal. After making that leap into comedy, Steve Harvey found himself homeless. He lived out of a 1976 Ford car, sleeping in the back seat and washing up in gas station sinks or public pools. A cooler in the trunk acted as his refrigerator. Sometimes he didn't eat. Sometimes he cried himself to sleep. He called it so depressing and admitted that many nights he was close to giving up. Still, he held on. He kept reading that dream every morning and every night, the one his dad told him to write down. That piece of paper, taped to the inside of a car window, was his lifeline. And when he was finally ready to give up completely, when he picked up the phone to call his father and admit defeat, something stopped him. His answering machine blinked with 2 messages. The first, a club in Jacksonville offering him $150. The second, another booking for the very next night. Suddenly Steve Harvey had $300, just enough to buy a cheap flight to New York. That flight would put him on stage at Showtime at the Apollo, a place that could change everything. One missed message, 1 minute later, and this story could have ended in silence. Instead, it was the beginning of something bigger. That performance at the Apollo put Steve in front of producers who saw his spark. Audiences responded, slowly the bookings increased, and just as importantly, people believed in him. A couple named Rich and Becky Liss gave him credit for travel and carpet cleaning supplies so he could earn a bit more money. They had nothing to gain, just faith in the man with a vision. Years later, on live TV, Steve broke down crying while thanking them. That moment, raw, real, and unscripted, showed how deeply those small acts of kindness shaped his survival. He said, "I will pay you back for the rest of my life." And he meant it. This period didn't just shape Steve Harvey, it carved him. Comedy wasn't just a career anymore. It was therapy. It was escape. It was his way of turning hunger into humour, fear into fire, and ridicule into something that could make others feel seen. By the late 1980s, he was getting traction. In 1990, he became a finalist in the Johnny Walker National Comedy Search. The kid who stuttered in Cleveland was now making crowds erupt with laughter nationwide. It was the proof he had been chasing since he was a child. He wasn't crazy for believing in himself. He just needed the world to catch up. After 1990, the doors that had once been sealed shut began to creak open. That same year, after his standout performance in the Johnny Walker National Comedy Search, Steve Harvey got his big break, an opportunity to appear on Showtime at the Apollo. But stepping on that Harlem stage wasn't just a career move, it was a moment years in the making. Behind the microphone stood not just a comedian, but a survivor. He had spent years in the back seat of a car. He had faced ridicule, hunger, and the kind of silence that almost broke him. And now, the same man who once whispered jokes to himself to stay sane was commanding the stage at one of the most iconic venues in American entertainment. For 7 straight years from the early 1990s onward, Steve Harvey hosted Showtime at the Apollo, building a reputation for charisma, quick wit, and a deep connection with the crowd. The show became his proving ground. Every joke wasn't just about making people laugh, it was about turning pain into performance. But there was a cost. Steve often worked 18-hour days, bouncing between gigs, writing sets, catching red-eye flights, and waking up before sunrise to prep for the next show. The grind was unforgiving. His back ached, his voice cracked, and his body pushed to the edge of collapse. "The laugh you hear is the wound I turned inside out," he once said, and yet, his star kept rising. In 1994, he landed the lead role in the short-lived sitcom Me and the Boys. 2 years later, he struck gold with The Steve Harvey Show on the WB, co-starring Cedric the Entertainer. The show ran for 6 seasons until 2002, becoming a major hit and solidifying Steve Harvey as not just a comedian, but a cultural icon. But here's where the success began to fracture his personal life. While the world saw a man on top of the world, behind the scenes, Steve was drowning in exhaustion and loss. The intense workload meant he was rarely home. He missed dinners, birthdays, and school plays. Fame was feeding his dream, but it was starving his family. His first marriage had already crumbled. Back in 1981, long before his breakout success, Steve married Marcia Harvey. Together, they had 3 children, twin daughters, Brandy and Carly, and a son, Broderick Jr. But the more time Steve spent chasing gigs, the more distance grew between them. By 1994, just as his professional life took off, his marriage ended. He admitted later, "I lost my family chasing the dream." It wasn't a headline, it was a personal reckoning. He was a father in name, but often absent in reality. He had once feared being invisible. Now, he feared being forgotten by his own children. That guilt haunted him. The laughter he brought to millions couldn't erase the silence at his dinner table. And even after the divorce, financial strain followed. Steve Harvey wasn't the multi-millionaire yet. He was still building, and the toll of losing his family left a scar deeper than any career setback. But just as one chapter closed, another began. In 1996, he married again, this time to Mary Shackelford. A few years later, they had a son, Winton, who became the centre of Steve's emotional world. For a time, it felt like a fresh start, a second chance to get fatherhood right, but storms were still on the horizon. The fame, the stress, and the growing public persona of Steve Harvey would once again collide with the fragile balance of home life. The cracks were already forming, even if the world couldn't see them yet. The early 2000s should have been the peak of Steve Harvey's career. His sitcom had just wrapped up after 6 successful seasons. He was respected, in demand, and soon about to be crowned as part of the legendary Kings of Comedy tour alongside Cedric the Entertainer, D.L. Hewley, and Bernie Mac. But beneath the fame, the spotlight was starting to burn. Behind the stage lights, his second marriage was beginning to break apart. Though he had hoped his relationship with Mary Shackelford would be a fresh start, the same patterns began to repeat. The missed dinners, the late nights, the constant travel. Steve was juggling everything: television, radio, stand-up, books, but he was slowly losing grip on the one thing he couldn't afford to lose again: his family. Then came 2005, and with it, disaster. The divorce between Steve and Mary wasn't just painful, it was public. She accused him of betrayal, questioned his character, and the media latched on instantly. Her claims flooded headlines, painting him as the villain, and even though the courts later dismissed most of the allegations, the damage was done. The spotlight turned brutal. Tabloids mocked him. Interviews shifted from comedy to courtroom drama. He was no longer just the man making people laugh. He was a headline for all the wrong reasons. But even worse than the press was what happened with his son. Winton, then just 8 years old, went to live with his mother. And Steve, already haunted by losing his first family, now faced another round of emotional devastation. He later admitted, "I could survive the tabloids, but not the look in my son's eyes." That kind of pain doesn't make headlines, but it never leaves. Alone in hotel rooms, surrounded by wealth and noise, Steve Harvey faced a new kind of silence, one filled with regret, absence, and the ache of missed memories. But the worst was yet to come. After the divorce settled, he did something routine. He went to check his bank account. And what stared back at him made his stomach drop. $1,700. That was all he had left. Despite being a household name, he was nearly broke. Then came the tax nightmare. Due to a disastrous accounting error, Steve Harvey discovered that for 7 straight years, his taxes had never been properly filed. He wasn't just in debt, he was in danger. The total amount owed, including interest and penalties, was enough to potentially ruin him. At one point, he feared prison. The IRS didn't care how famous he was. So he did what he had always done. He fought. While others would have crumbled, Steve Harvey went into survival mode. He took on every opportunity he could. Radio in the mornings, comedy gigs at night, business meetings in between. No luxury, no breaks, just work. Every dollar he earned went straight to the IRS. Every laugh I told back then was paid for in fear, he once said. But he didn't stop. He wrote books like Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man in 2009, followed by Straight Talk, No Chaser in 2010. Those weren't just projects, they were lifelines. Every page he wrote wasn't just advice, it was survival. The books became bestsellers, the money helped dig him out. Then came his biggest lifeline yet: Family Feud. In 2010, he stepped in as host. Within just 3 years, the show's ratings exploded. What began as another gig turned into a national phenomenon. Suddenly, Steve Harvey wasn't just back. He was bigger than ever. But here's the part most people never saw. Even at the height of his Family Feud comeback, every paycheck still went to the IRS. He was working not to get rich, but to stay out of ruin. The spotlight might have been bright, but behind the scenes, he was counting every cent. That was the real tragedy of this chapter. Not the fame, not the failure, but the fact that a man who had once slept in a car was now sleeping in million-dollar homes and still feeling the same fear. Because $1,700 wasn't just a number. It was a memory, a reminder of how quickly it could all be lost. By the mid-2000s, just as Steve Harvey was clawing his way out of financial ruin and emotional exhaustion, something unexpected happened. Something that didn't come with lights or applause. He reconnected with a woman he had met years earlier at a comedy club in Memphis, someone who had stuck in his mind ever since he pointed to her in the crowd and said, "I don't know who you are, but I'm going to marry you one day." Her name was Marjorie Bridges, and this time, fate didn't just circle back, it arrived right on time. Steve was 50, scarred and weary. He had just come through 2 failed marriages, near bankruptcy, and the kind of public shame that can permanently stain a career. But Marjorie didn't see the broken man. She saw someone worth rebuilding. They married in 2007, and almost instantly, Steve Harvey's life began to shift. Not in terms of fame, he was already a star, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. Marjorie gave him something the industry never could: peace. She made him slow down, reminded him to eat, urged him to rest, and prayed over him when he couldn't find the strength himself. This wasn't just love, it was repair. Together they created a blended family of 7 children, Steve's 3 from previous relationships, Marjorie's 3, and their shared son, Winton. At first, there was hesitation. Step parenting isn't easy. Trust takes time. But Steve Harvey made one bold move that said it all. He gave her children his last name. Not as a gesture, but as a promise. Then came the moment that cracked him open on live TV. In 2015, during a televised tribute, Jason, one of Marjorie's sons, turned to Steve and said, "You gave me your last name. There's no one better than you, Dad." The auditorium fell silent. Steve, usually composed, broke down in tears. That wasn't performance, it was release. All the years of pain, distance, and guilt, all the family he thought he'd lost, now stood in front of him, whole. "She saved me," he's often said of Marjorie. But more than that, she reminded him he was worth saving. He had spent decades trying to prove himself to the world, to rebuild finances, reputation, and reach. But now, he had something far more valuable. Dinners with all 7 children at one table, quiet mornings with grandkids, and a wife who believed in him more than the applause ever did. This was the healing he didn't know he needed. There were no headlines about it, no viral moments, just the sound of laughter in the house. Just birthday parties with every child standing in the same photo. Just evenings when Steve Harvey wasn't a celebrity, he was just Dad. And for a man who had once whispered, "I lost my first family chasing the dream," this chapter wasn't just redemption, it was restoration. But here's the thing, he still never stopped grinding. Even in peace, he kept building. His family became the reason to work harder, not the excuse to stop. With Marjorie by his side, he founded Steve Harvey Global, expanded Family Feud internationally, and took on new challenges in wellness and entrepreneurship. But now, it wasn't out of fear. It was driven by vision. This chapter wasn't about chasing success, it was about protecting what he'd rebuilt. It was about waking up every morning not just to work, but to live. For the first time in a long time, Steve Harvey didn't feel like he was running from something, he felt like he was running towards something better. By the time Steve Harvey reached his 60s, he had become more than a household name. He was now the architect of a media empire, from hosting Family Feud and Celebrity Family Feud to producing content under Steve Harvey Global. His reach extended across continents. His morning radio show aired from 6 to 10 a.m, and his presence remained a daily fixture in homes across America and even overseas in places like South Africa and Ghana, where he launched international versions of Family Feud. But behind the scenes, something else was changing. Fame no longer excited him the way it once did. After building an empire, surviving personal collapse, and raising a blended family, Steve Harvey began focusing on something far more urgent: his health. He had pushed his body to its limits for decades: long hours, stress, inconsistent sleep, poor nutrition, and now it was catching up with him. He revealed he had high blood pressure and symptoms of sleep apnea. At times, the fatigue hit so hard he would blank out mid-conversation. His body was waving red flags, warning that the lifestyle he had survived for years was no longer sustainable. He began to rethink everything: what he ate, how he moved, how he rested. So, like everything else in his life, he tackled it head-on. Steve Harvey dropped 30 pounds after age 50, switching to a strict clean diet and relentless daily workouts. He transformed his health regimen into a new business venture, Levate U, a supplement brand he co-founded. For him, it wasn't about getting rich, it was about survival, both for himself and for those who followed him. "Health is my covenant with my family," he said. It wasn't just about adding years to his life, it was about being present for his grandchildren, his wife, and the empire he had fought so hard to build. He understood that no trophy or mansion could replace a missed birthday or a quiet dinner at home. Still, he couldn't escape the past completely. The infamous 2015 Miss Universe mistake, where he accidentally announced the wrong winner, continued to haunt him. Despite owning the error and returning the following year to host again, memes and mockery followed him for years. That single moment, seen by millions, became a lasting shadow, something that resurfaced every time his name trended online. But he didn't hide, he leaned in. Hosting the pageant again was more than redemption, it was defiance. It was about reclaiming his voice in the face of global embarrassment. And yet, even with that strength, Steve Harvey confessed that some nights he still thinks about that error, not because of what the world said, but because of how hard he worked to build a reputation he feared had unraveled in 60 seconds. And deeper still was the ghost that never left him, the memory of $1,700. That number still lingered in the back of his mind, not as a financial figure, but as a warning, a reminder of how fragile everything really is. He may live in a $15 million estate in Atlanta, complete with an infinity pool and a hidden underground ballroom, but the fear of losing it all never fully goes away, because once you've been broke, truly broke, you never forget. His lifestyle today might look lavish: yachts, luxury watches, designer suits, and jaw-dropping real estate. But even now, Steve Harvey lives with the discipline of someone who remembers sleeping in a car and counting coins for gas. He once said, "I still think about $1,700. To some, it's a throwaway line, but to him, it's scripture. It's what keeps him grounded. It's what drives him to keep working, keep building, and keep showing up, even when he doesn't have to. Because the applause fades, but the responsibility stays. Despite the empire, despite the health transformation, despite the late-life peace that Steve Harvey fought so hard to create, there's something that still hangs over him, and it's not failure. It's the quiet burden of everything he missed while chasing the dream." Harvey has been open about it. He's admitted that at the height of his fame, when his face was on TV every night and his jokes filled arenas, he would sit alone in hotel rooms after shows and feel empty. Applause roared in public, but in private, silence always had the final word. And that silence wasn't new. It had followed him his entire life. It was there when he sat in a car with nothing but a cooler in the trunk. It was there when his first marriage ended, when his son left with his ex-wife, when headlines painted him as a villain, when memes mocked his worst moment. Every time he climbed higher, the silence waited at the top. That's why legacy matters so deeply to him now. Not legacy in terms of ratings, Emmys, or box office numbers, but the kind of legacy that gets passed around the dinner table. One built on showing up, on being present, on knowing that when he's gone, what remains isn't just TV footage, but children and grandchildren who know who he really was. In his words, Applause fades. Family stays. The man who once measured success by the size of his audience now measures it by the number of kids seated at dinner. The quiet moments, watching his grandchildren play, hearing one of his daughters call just to check in, have become the rewards he never knew he needed. But here's the hidden truth. He's still afraid. Not of failure, not anymore, but of losing the peace he fought for, of letting the world creep back in and steal the joy he built brick by brick. That's why his routines are strict, why he guards his health, his time, and his energy. Because everything he has now wasn't handed to him. It was earned through suffering. Even in wealth, he lives like a survivor. He still wakes up early, still works like he's behind, still treats every show, every shoot, every interview like it could be his last, because he knows better than most. You don't always get second chances. He once said, "Every time I thought I was done, God showed me I was just turning the page." That's what keeps him going, not fear, but faith, a belief that there's more ahead even when the world thinks the story is over. And the final chapters, they're not written on stages anymore. They're written in quiet conversations, in Sunday dinners, in whispered apologies turned into lifelong bonds, in the healing that happens not when the lights are on, but when the house is still and the people you love are still in the room. By the time Steve Harvey turned 68, his name had touched every corner of entertainment. He was no longer just the face of Family Feud. He had become a symbol of resilience. His voice, once choked by a stutter, now carried across radio waves, movie theatres, podcasts, and international game shows. His empire stretched far beyond cameras and scripts. It was now rooted in something deeper, clarity about what truly matters. He often says, "Everything I have, 85% of it came after I married Marjorie." And he's not talking about money. He's talking about stability, about the life that began when the chasing stopped and the building began. Building a home, a family, a life that didn't rely on applause to feel complete. At his estate in Atlanta, where chandeliers light the hidden ballroom and grandkids run through wide hallways, Steve Harvey finally found the one thing he never had as a child: security, and he's determined to protect it, not just for himself, but for his children and their children. He said it bluntly, "I still think about $1,700. It doesn't matter how big the house is, how many zeros are on a check, or how many Rolexes sit in his drawer. That memory, checking an account and seeing only a whisper of dignity left, is a scar that never really fades. It's what keeps him working, what keeps him grounded, what keeps him grateful." But here's the full circle truth that makes his story unforgettable. The same kid who was told he'd never be on television now owns the rights to shows broadcast around the world. The same man who once cried in the back of a car now cries tears of joy during family dinners. The same father who feared losing his son now shares stages, vacations, and laughter with him. And even in his pain, he never stopped giving back. Through his Steve and Marjorie Harvey Foundation, he supported young people from underserved communities, helping them find their voice, their footing, and their future. Because he remembers what it felt like to be ignored, to be laughed at, to be dismissed, and he refuses to let the next generation face the same storm alone. That's the real legacy. Not the cars, not the suits, not the stages, but the ability to look someone in the eye and say, "I've been where you are, and I'm still standing." For Steve Harvey, tragedy was never a single moment. It wasn't the Miss Universe mistake. It wasn't the divorces or the IRS. It was the accumulation of wounds that almost stole his voice before he even had a chance to use it. But what makes his story powerful isn't the pain, it's what he did with it. He turned ridicule into purpose. He turned stutters into speeches. He turned silence into empire. And at nearly 70 years old, he doesn't want pity. He wants people to know that healing is real, that second chances exist, and that no matter how far you fall, faith, discipline, and love can raise you higher than you ever imagined. Because in the end, Steve Harvey's tragedy wasn't the end of his story. It was the reason his story matters at all. There's a reason Steve Harvey's story continues to resonate across generations. It's not just because he's funny. It's not the game shows, the viral moments, or the sharp suits. It's because he represents something rare in a world obsessed with image. Authenticity through adversity. Every step he's taken has come at a price. He's paid in sleepless nights, broken relationships, public humiliation, and quiet, private suffering. But he never gave up. Not when he was homeless. Not when his bank account hit $1,700. Not when the IRS came knocking. Not when the world laughed at his Miss Universe mistake. And not when he looked in the mirror and saw a father who hadn't always been there. And that's why people connect with him, because underneath the success is a man who's walked through every kind of fire. He didn't dodge the hardship, he went straight through it, and he came out the other side with something stronger than wealth or fame: wisdom. At this stage of his life, Steve Harvey is no longer building for himself. He's building for the people who come after him, his kids, his grandkids, the young comedians who think they'll never make it, the men trying to recover from mistakes, the people who are 2 steps from giving up but just need someone to say, "Keep going, you're not done yet," and he leads by example. He wakes up early, works out, hosts shows, runs companies, and still makes time to sit around the dinner table. Because now he understands that success without peace isn't worth it, that no stage is more important than the people waiting for you at home. But he'll never forget where it all started. That classroom, that ripped piece of paper, that teacher who said he'd never be on TV, that stutter, that cold car, that moment of silence when he almost gave up, that $1,700. Those moments didn't break him, they built him. And even now, with millions in the bank and a global brand to his name, Steve Harvey still fights like he's trying to earn it all over again. Because he knows that comfort is not a guarantee, it's a responsibility. He's not just a star, he's a blueprint, a reminder that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how many mistakes you've made, there is always a way forward. You just have to keep writing the next page. Because Steve Harvey didn't just survive tragedy, he transformed it. He took the pain, the ridicule, and the doubt, and turned it into a life that's not only successful, but meaningful. And that is why, at 68, his story doesn't just inspire, it humbles. It reminds us that the scars we carry can become the strongest parts of who we are if we refuse to let them define us.